Lavender Coretta contains mature themes. All videos are kept unage restricted so that the information provided is free to all, regardless of age or demographic. However, viewer discretion is advised. Hey everyone, thank you for all the support on that last video. I can tell that we have a lot of people who are new to the channel. If you fit that description, welcome. You can expect to see more videos like that. I'm someone who just likes to be extremely open about sexuality. I mostly focus on heterosexual issues because that's what I am, but I'd like to expand that to more groups very soon. Anyway, today's video is about fantasies, something I've neglected to talk about until now. The reason? Well, on the list of things that cause people to be afraid of sex, this is pretty much number one. But it's an important thing to talk about. This is the real connective tissue between people who don't accept themselves and people who do. So, let's get into it. By the way, if the audio for this video sounds a bit different, I'm trying a new recording strategy. We'll see how it works. It's supposed to reduce me straining my voice near the end, so hopefully it works out. So, what are sexual fantasies? Sexual fantasies are imagined scenarios where you engage in any kind of sexual situation. These scenarios don't have to be anything but vanilla. You can have a fantasy of being happily married and making love to your spouse. But a surprising amount of people do have fantasies that are somewhat atypical. Group sex, forced sex, fetishism, voyeurism, stuff like that. This video isn't about those specific fantasies. They definitely deserve a video of their own. But since I brought them up, fetishism is like well, according to Google, it's a form of sexual behavior in which gratification is strongly linked to a particular object or activity, or a part of the body, other than the sexual organs. And voyeurism is the practice of gaining sexual pleasure from watching others, when they're naked or engaged in sexual activity. Now, I'd argue that voyeurism isn't really atypical. I mean, we've had discussions about how many people watch porn. It's a big thing. But it's listed as one on Wikipedia, so there you go. The main thing I want you to take away from this video is that fantasies are just fantasies. This is something that a lot of people get wrong about sex and sexual exploration. They think that when someone has a fantasy, that's basically foreshadowing something they're going to attempt to do in the future. This is not true. For example, someone might have the common fantasy of one of their professors or teachers starting an intimate relationship with them. It's a simple power dynamic that can be gratifying for some people. I guarantee you that most people have thought about this at least once, even if it was just a passing thought. But a fantasy like this is rarely attempted. Most people are content with this remaining fantasy. We'll get into the research, but it's important to understand the idea that it's more common to remain in complete control of your thoughts and actions. I understand that Psychology Today isn't the most primary of sources, but they have an excerpt here that I like. It goes like this. Just because an individual has a sexual fantasy doesn't mean that they have an interest in acting it out. Part of having a fantasy is to explore an interest, a curiosity, even a repulsion. If someone hears about a sexual act that triggers disgust in the person, they might not full stop ignore what they heard. They might briefly entertain a scenario in which they are a participant in the act that they find repulsive. This may be done in part to validate that they have no interest in such a sexual act, and in part to try to understand what others find enticing about it. A common example of this is heterosexual individuals having homoerotic fantasies. In this case, the word fantasy doesn't really mean wanting it to happen. Fantasies are just thoughts, and they may be briefly entertained to confirm a heterosexual person's own sexuality. I've thought about it, and if you're straight, you probably have too. It's a sign of someone who's actually secure in their sexuality. You've thought about it, you've considered the possibility, then rejected it. Now, maybe it didn't gross you out as much as it thought you would. Or, maybe it didn't gross you out as much as you thought it would. Then you can follow this line of thinking and you can test the waters with your whole sexuality thing. There's an old concept in psychology and sociology called the I and the me. Basically, the I represents our impulses, our internal desires. Your I tells you that you see someone that you want to have sex with, walking down the street, just casual. But obviously you don't act on this I force. Your I is kept in check by your me, which considers which action you should take in the context of the people around you. Your me stops your I by saying, wait a minute, that would be bad. We need to go through the proper channels in order to do that. Talking to them, dating, etc., etc. These kinds of internal debates are happening constantly throughout the day. Admittedly, it is kind of scary to believe that people have two wolves inside of them. One of them is full of desire, and the other one is doing everything he can to hold him back. That's terrifying. But you don't have to view the I and me model as fact. It's kind of just a thing we came up with in an attempt to describe human behavior. It's only there to remind you that there's a difference between what someone wants and what someone will actually do, to get that done. Sometimes the private thrill is enough. Sometimes a perfectly good fantasy is spoiled when reality does not meet the ideal of the fantasy. This might sound like a bit of a tangent, but it is relevant. I have observed that a lot of people on the political right don't agree with exploring yourself in this way because they believe that it removes your agency. Agency is just your willingness to take control of yourself. And that's one of the big reasons they don't agree with a lot of the stuff on the political left, actually. I say this as someone who's existed in both camps. I've leaned both right and left several times in my life already. I know that a lot of conservatives will look at Democrats saying things like, I need support for Group X, and believe it to be an excuse to be lazy. What they miss is that sometimes, especially in modern times, a problem grows beyond an individual's control and becomes systemic. But we're not here to discuss politics. I only bring this up to point out the fact that teaching people they're in control of their own thoughts and behaviors is literally teaching people to recognize their own agency. That's why I believe it's possible to convince the people who doubt this stuff that it can work in our society. Psychology Today says, there are few topics in human sexuality as complex as sexual fantasies. Living out sexual fantasies can greatly improve one's sex life and contribute to increased sexual well-being. There are many benefits to acting on your sexual desires, but that does not mean you need to flip the switch from desire to behavior. Sexual fantasy allows us to consider what we may like or what we certainly do not. Sexual fantasy also allows us to better understand the sexual predilections of another person. And of course, sexual fantasy can just be plain fun, in and of itself. In the mind, you control the fantasy. You have the final say in what happens. How, where, when, and with who. You construct the fantasy in such a way that the scenario is perfect for you. There are no such guarantees in the real world. You could reasonably say that, based on the last video, Futanari is somewhat of a fantasy for me. But it's a fantasy that's intertwined with a lot of other things that make it physically impossible. Genitalia that is, size-wise, physically impossible, along with the fact that I'm drawing Candle's creatures, who are of an indeterminate species. Well, I know what they are, but I'm not revealing that to you just yet. I've created a fantasy that is almost entirely unique to me, based upon the merging of several things. And this is what I mean when I use the term sexual palette. When you really dig into someone's sexuality, it's this complicated web of dynamics, past experiences, and objects that are almost entirely unique to that person, like a fingerprint. Sexuality has become something that is equally in the mind as it is real, and there are parts of sexuality that are so complex that they will forever remain fantasies, and nothing more. And that's okay. I was surprised when I was able to find a small data sample of men's versus women's fantasies. It's on Wikipedia, and they go more into detail than I will here, but here it is. As you can see, men and women aren't on a perfectly even split when it comes to who often has what fantasy. Fantasies are often based in things like biological drives. Women seek partners with resources, which means partners of status, which means that women are more likely to fantasize about doing it with a celebrity. Conversely, because of the role that sperm and semen play, men are more inclined to spread their genetic data further in a spread approach, leading to more group sex fantasies. Also, keep in mind that 3 of 4 of these fantasies I have listed here are more often acted out by women rather than men. According to numerous sources cited by Wikipedia, women are more likely to act out their fantasies. However, this may be due to the fact that women tend to focus on fantasies that are possible to occur in real life with some effort. Like Of course, a woman with a homosexual fantasy is more likely to act on it than a man who's into futanari. One of them is significantly easier to achieve. Even so, it's common for men and women to have the same first sexual fantasies. Specifically, two fantasies. One of them is celebrities, and the other one is teachers. It's nearly universal that if somebody is to engage in fantasies, these two are the first. Now, I have to be careful, because this next talking point is going to be controversial. I know that going in. For the rest of this video, there's going to be a trigger warning for talk of sexual violence. One scenario that people really want to avoid talking about is the fantasy of rape. I do not want to get this wrong, so I'm going to read what it says word for word. Rape, or ravishment, is a common sexual fantasy among both men and women, either generically or as an ingredient in a particular sexual scenario. The fantasy may involve the fantasist as either the one being forced or coerced into sexual activity, or they might be the perpetrator. Some studies have found that women tend to fantasize about being forced into sex more commonly than men do. A 1974 study by Harrington and Singer found that being overpowered or forced to surrender was the second most frequent fantasy in their survey. A 1984 study by Nafo and Jaff, I don't know if I said those correctly, ranked being overpowered as their study's most common fantasy during intercourse. And a 1988 study by Pelletier and Harold, again, I don't know if I said those right, they found that over half of their female respondents had fantasies of forced sex. Keep in mind, these studies are old, so you kinda have to take them with a grain of salt. Other studies have found this theme, but with lower frequency and popularity. However, these female fantasies in no way imply that the subject desires to be raped in reality. The fantasies often contain romantic images where the woman imagines herself being seduced, and in these fantasies, the male that she imagines is actually desirable. Most importantly, the woman remains in full control of her fantasy. This might sound counterintuitive to the fantasy itself. Rape involves non-consensual sex where the woman is not in control. But this is a scenario where it is rape, but the difference is she's controlling the narrative. So it's not really right to call it rape fantasy. The fantasies do not usually involve the woman getting hurt. Conversely, some women who have been sexually victimized in the past report unwanted sexual fantasies, similar to flashbacks of their victimization. Keep that in mind. A past history of this sex crime leads to unwanted fantasies. That will come into play later. They are realistic, and the woman may recall the physical and psychological pain involved. The most frequently cited hypothesis for why women fantasize of being forced into some sexual activity is that the fantasy avoids societally induced guilt. The woman does not have to admit responsibility for her sexual desires and behavior. Again, keep in mind, these are very old studies, so may not be true. A 1978 study by Morault and Fallingstad was consistent with this hypothesis and found that women with high levels of sex guilt were more likely to report fantasy themed around being overpowered, dominated, and helpless. In contrast, Pelletier and Harold used a different measure of guilt and found no correlation. Other research suggests that women who report forced sex fantasies have a more positive attitude towards sexuality, contradicting the guilt hypothesis. A 1998 study by Strasberg and Lockard found that women who fantasized about force were generally less guilty and more erotrophilic, and as a result had more frequent and more varied fantasies. Additionally, it's said that forced fantasies are clearly not the most common nor the most frequent. So really, the data is kind of up in the air on that one. It might be more common among women, it might not. But the reason I bring this up is because I'm afraid of someone hearing that it might be and using it as an excuse to try it with their partner, unprompted. If this is a fantasy of you or your partner, it requires consent, no matter who's the perpetrator and who's the receiver. I know that contrasts with the definition of non-consensual sex, but this is what safe words are used for. You have a clear beginning and an end to the scene, and you come up with a safe word that you or your partner can say if they change their mind or if it becomes too much. It's basically the same as a director yelling "cut" on a film set. Now, here's where we get to the last part of this discussion, and it's the most uncomfortable, but I have to bring it up. This discussion of the rape fantasy leads to the question that most people have when they first engage with these kinds of thoughts. Won't this lead to the worst of the worst? I don't think I need to spell it out for you. The P word. Again, trigger warning. Are other fantasies that involve non-consensual actions leading to that one fantasy that we don't allow ever? The short answer is no. They don't lead to that fantasy, and here's why. It is true that most people who have committed sex crimes have reported prior fantasies about the situations. A rapist will fantasize about doing it beforehand. But this doesn't mean that the fantasy alone is what led them to commit the action. The real culprit here is a deterioration of mental health over a long period of time, and without intervention. Other risk factors may include, and I quote, mental disorders, paranoia, psychosis, violent history, arrests, poor academic performance, substance abuse, financial gain, unemployment, and watching pornography. However, it is usually the combination of sexual childhood abuse and deviant fantasies that facilitate the jump from sexual fantasies to sexual crimes, and the nature of the crimes. For example, most rapists report both early traumatic experiences and sexually deviant fantasies, and sex murderers of children reported a significantly more pre-crime childhood sexual abuse and deviant sexual fantasies than sexual murderers of women. All of this is to say, when it comes to committing sex crimes, the fantasy itself doesn't lead to the crime, and less serious fantasies will not lead to the most egregious example of fantasy. It's only when the fantasy is combined with several other factors. There's an element of deteriorated mental health that can't be ignored. That's like saying, going to a gun range on the weekends will make you want to shoot up a school. Owning a gun doesn't automatically increase the likelihood that you will commit this heinous act. It gives you the means to do so, but it's important to recognize the difference between having the ability to do something and actually wanting to do something. You know, I have the ability to crash my car into the nearest pedestrian, but that doesn't mean I'm going to do it. I know it seems like a slippery slope, and a really scary one at that. A lot of us are uncomfortable talking about this because, we don't know where that line is. There is almost no research done, hasn't been done, on where people fall into that trap of this is the fantasy that we are not allowing. Many people, like myself, are scared that these fantasies will lead to this one, but all evidence points to the fact that no, there is no link between having these fantasies and this really bad one. This one only comes into being when there are many, many other risk factors, and when it's intermixed with past trauma that was not gotten help with. That's the point we need to know. I want you to understand that it's okay to have fantasies that you would never act on. Like my Futanari fantasy or the teacher fantasy. All of these are very common, and the mechanisms that create them are normal. The mechanisms that create this one are not normal. Very different. If you have a fantasy that makes you uncomfortable and it bothers you, you should talk to a therapist. Remember that you are in control of your behavior. You have agency. A fantasy doesn't mean you're doomed to become someone horrible, but it is your responsibility to take care of your fantasies. Recognize when you face those other risk factors we discussed, and seek help for those things. The fantasies aren't reality concept is something I've echoed in a lot of my videos, but it didn't truly hit me until the last one. I've always carried some shame about certain fantasies, but that was the first time where I really felt at peace with myself. Hearing myself talk about having control was the thing to finally convince me that yes, I do have control, and so do you. We are not the same as those monsters, because my fantasies are just that, fantasies. Anyway, I hope this video helped you in some way. It's one of the touchiest subjects that I could tackle on this channel, but I felt that it was the right time to finally tackle it. If that circumcision video is anything to go on, sometimes I misspeak, sometimes I miss certain aspects of a concept, but my videos are vehicles for information, teaching lessons. They're just as much that as they are me sharing my own experience with you. My scripts are very loosely written, so if you disagree, let me know why in the comments, but keep in mind, we're all working with different base information, because we all have different perspectives. But I've decided that after doing this research that for me,
I'm not going to be scared of my fantasies anymore. Now that I know that they're not going to lead me to something worse, and I know that I am in control, I'm comfortable with them now. So, yeah, I hope you got something out of this. Subscribe for more discussion videos like these. They'll usually be less serious. Usually they're about dicks and butts and fun stuff like that, not this serious stuff, but sometimes we have to have these serious talks. Anyways, my name is Candles. I love you all. Good night.